Many observers have failed to articulate what really makes Elden Ring tick. It is of such a high standard of quality, from art direction to story to combat to level design to music, that its greatness is largely undisputed. Emphasis is usually made on Elden Ring as a Soulsborne game. For me, the appeal of Elden Ring stems from a very different source. It establishes this formula from the very beginning. It's not Dark Souls, but that's not bad. Saying Elden Ring is a masterpiece is about as useful as saying the sky is blue. We all accept it to be true. Elden Ring is the sort of game that comes once in a generation. It is of such a high standard of quality in every aspect, from art direction to story to combat to level design to music, that its greatness is largely undisputed. Critics are few and far between, and enthusiasts are everywhere. For goodness sakes, the game sold over 20 million copies worldwide, earned a Metacritic rating of 96, and while better YouTubers than myself have unveiled the mysteries of its complex lore and evaluated its strengths and weaknesses, emphasis is usually made on Elden Ring as a Soulsborne game. You see, this always confused me. Yes, much of the game was highly reminiscent of Dark Souls, in particular the legacy dungeons, the gameplay style, and also kind of the cryptic lore. But I think by viewing it as a member of the Soulsborne family, many observers have failed to articulate what really makes Elden Ring tick. In this video, I'm going to attempt to do this and conclusively set the record on why Elden Ring is a perfect game. You see, as I said, I always felt a very different energy when playing Elden Ring than I did when I played Dark Souls 3 or Bloodborne. In those games, I found myself hooked in by the intensely difficult but fulfilling combat, intricate level design, and characteristic Soulsborne vibe. The first thought that pops into my mind when Dark Souls 3 is mentioned is that impeccable sound and art direction. But for me, the appeal of Elden Ring stems from a very different source. A source that makes it, in my opinion, a fundamentally different game to any of the Soulsborne titles. And this source is the open world. When I loaded Elden Ring every night, I wasn't thinking about boss fights. In fact, the open world meant I could actively avoid them. I was solely focused on exploring it more. You see, Elden Ring is about finding interesting items, hidden underground Lovecraftian cities, and multi-location storylines, and less about navigating intensely difficult dungeons and uncovering cryptic lore. It establishes this formula from the very beginning. After the excellent character creator, you emerge in the Lands Between as a level 1 Tarnished, and are forced into a virtually unbeatable boss battle. Following what can only be described as a thorough arse-shredding, you are dropped straight into a vast green, open plain known as Limgrave. This entrance to Limgrave sets up Elden Ring's vast and densely packed open world. You are sent into the vast plains of Limgrave with no sense of direction, left to play according to personal whims and curiosities. Let's compare this to the opening of Dark Souls 3. In Dark Souls 3, you awaken in the Cemetery of Ash, and much like Elden Ring, are forced into a boss battle with the great but difficult to pronounce Udix Gunda. I don't know. But unlike Elden Ring, instead of being left to explore the world, you are directed to the main hub, Firelink Shrine, and pushed directly into the main plot. Now, of course, you can always approach things in a slightly different way, do this boss first, miss his optional one, but for the most part, you're on a linear pathway. Now, just to make it clear, I'm not hating on this formula. Dark Souls 3 is an excellent game, but I think looking at its formula is a useful tool to show why I think the two games are so different. You see, From Software uses these openings to set up very different experiences with very distinct gameplay DNAs. The opening of Elden Ring was meant to immediately establish that the game was fundamentally about self-directed exploration, whereas Dark Souls 3 sets up a linear, atmospheric adventure with enthralling content and cryptic story with intensely difficult boss battles. And this difference is what I want to highlight. You see, I think adding so much freedom and choice to Elden Ring changed the Soulsborne DNA quite fundamentally, and in many ways improved it. Now, as I said before, it didn't completely abandon the traditional Dark Souls, Bloodborne, so on and so forth formula. Many aspects of the games are very similar, for example, the combat. However, it did de-emphasize some of the traditional Soulsborne features and create a very distinct experience from its spiritual predecessors. First of all, the combat. Soulsborne titles were universally known for their difficulty, for their inaccessibility, and for causing an almost mind-numbing form of insanity as you spend hours and hours trying to conquer the same thing. Boss fights in particular stood out for the exceptional challenge they posed, such that many have become legendary across the internet and the gaming community. Think of Ornstein's Mal and so on and so forth. And this was because of a simple gameplay feature, a gameplay feature that is purposefully de-emphasized in Elden Ring. In traditional Soulsborne titles, no matter how much you grinded for XP, ultimately battles came down to one thing, and one thing only: personal skill. Trinkets and levels only amplified your abilities and were not a substitution for competence. This made Dark Souls or Bloodborne and so on and so forth a slog to play through, but a joy to conquer. Like real life, delayed gratification made the win feel so much sweeter. And I'm not saying Elden Ring doesn't have these boss fights. I'm not going to spoil it, not everyone's played it, but there are certain fights that are known for their exceptional difficulty. However, one cannot deny from a holistic picture, the freedom allotted to the player does somewhat take out their edge. When you can avoid some of them or come back to them later, level up, rather than being forced to spend hours and hours on a single objective that you can't avoid, it takes away from some of the traditional Soulsborne experience. Instead, the game almost emphasizes exploration, discovery, finding new items, improving your buffs, finding new spells, over tackling challenges with a very simple set of gear and your own personal skill. A very similar situation emerges with the lore. Elden Ring's lore is very cryptic, multifaceted and complicated, but it doesn't compare to the Lovecraftian confusion of Bloodborne or the gargantuan lore of the Dark Souls series. Strangely enough, many players, including myself, were actually able to understand the plot. Now, I suspect this is because the game director Miyazaki tasked George R.R. Martin, the author most known for the A Song of Ice and Fire series, to develop the plot, and so it carried some of the core quality of life features that are common to pop storytelling. But again, I don't believe this is a sacrifice. Of course, many were disheartened. Some very niche supporters were against this. Whenever the winds of change blow, so does an oppositional current. And I can see how many would see these changes as a dilution of the core Soulsborne essence, but I have to completely disagree. To start off with the boss fights, removing the linearity is a brilliant means of introducing the player to the vast and intensely beautiful world of Elden Ring. One can't even explain the experience of entering an underground chasm full of large statues or a mystical city that seems as though it was submerged under the stars, and this would not be possible if the route taken was more linear. And that's fundamentally what I want to get out in this video. I think its difference needs to be acknowledged as the reason why this is the greatest title they have ever produced. It's not Dark Souls, but that's not a bad thing.